Chúng sinh không lìa an vui, tức là không phải chịu khổ đau. Xin nguyện cho mọi chúng sinh an trụ trong hạnh xả, không chấp thủ và sân hận đối với những chúng sinh chấp thủ xa gần. Sangha cho kê cho nam la chẳng chum ba du dani kep so chi da ge jin so ge bai so nam ge ro la pen je sang ge du ba so Sam chen tam che de wa tang de wei chu tang den ba chu ji Sam chen tam chen du nghêu tang du nghêu chi chu tang de wa chu ji Sam chen tam chen du nghêu me be de wa tang me de wa chu ji Sam chen tam chen ni wen cha tang ni tang de wei Tăng Nom Lan Mê Ban Chu Chi. Page 43. Long Mandala offering.
Shangam Beva Ishu Om Benza Bume Aho Wanjin Seke Sai She Om Benza Reke Aho Chichari Koyo Ke Kowe Uso Reke Warira Shalubapo Hon Zambolin Ro Palancho Chandra Minye Lutan Lupa Ngaya Dang Ngaya Shin Yenden Tang Lam Jodo Draminyen Tang Draminyen Yenda Rinpoche Rewo Pasangishin De Chaya Pa Mame Pa Ye Loto Kolo Rinpoche Nobo Rinpoche Tumo Rinpoche Lambo Rinpoche Lambo Rinpoche Tajo Rinpoche Mabe Rinpoche Techemba Ye Pumba Ye Ma Tewa Ma Lo Ma Gama Mendo Ma Tobe Ma Nanse Ma Tijama Ni Ma Dawa Rinpoche Ko Chole Namba Geve Genzen Uzola Dhammi Penjo Puzon Tsopa Matsa Meva Sashi Yitong Teda Chinchen Tsawata Giva Jeve Panden Lama Tamba Namta Kewa Tuya Yongi Give Shenyen Chenpo Gen Rinpo Chen Shengane Tegwa Jimbe Sunju Samo Shuwe Yendo Shingam Bewa Kewo Tujin Drowe Dambu Shesu Shene Janga So Roa Mangyu Namge Tada Nyembe Semjen Tamje La Tuzewa Chembe Goni Sishi Chodan Tumonge Ngatu Malewa Zedu Sai je pe ye chun je me chang re ro ni she nyen de gen bo de san je shin de me de be wa ye Dogen Shinga Chewa Shu Zoshi Peje Zhongzhen Chan Re Sanje Shinde Mitembe Vaye Dogenanda Shenla Chevajo Vajebeke Chunshi Melodram Realishe Yende Gemboy Sanje Shinde Mitembe Vaye Dogenanda Shinda Chevaisho Idam Guru Rana Mendala Kanayatayami.
Bushole, Maripadan Dawatra Basole, no, you be Kanji Rama Juchi Teneva. Boleva, Kanji Juchi Teneva. Getting dairy dance in Bermechina, Yasa no Shama Juju, Telechina Kanga no Aduse. Kanji Rama Dula attended the United Social Rama. The Kuga take it. Do it. Yeah. Kanji Rama Juchi Tune Bash. Majogala, what is it? Majogala, Kanji Rama Juchi Tune. Then there it comes in Kanji Rama Juchi Tune Bash, getting dear than Zimba Missionas. Yasa Lune Shama Juju, Telechine Kangilon, Yusuda. Aranzo Manchate, Namdi Kawashan, Tundula Soba, Kawashan, the Shanlangiora. Oh, Titu Niti Karsore. Ramakone Church, Kugabda, Alwatan Jorbashta Yomardo. Tundu Silkevena. Ashena Keke Yomardo Kegacha Mare. Atare Milutanjo Milutoban, Tomnini. Kawachima Karchima Chiteso Rawi become the Sungara. And the Rawa Juchins. Tingi Samatam just hung there during the last Sungara. Getting dear than Zimban Mechena or the day cook up some to the Ralaria near Soloma. Drag members young Samaluache. Father me, when the Kobaya Tobashima to Nasogora, Checo de Sungora, Kanzerachi Chena, get it down, dear Tan Zimban Mechena, so Zimban Mechenas the Maya Suluali, I came in Zimban Mechena Sogora. And I answered in some Songova. Zimbachi said, Kiwate, Lada me, Kiwasambul Tovetera. Yasa Luashawan Jujura said, Kadia, said Delepa, Gason Drumbugo and the Kiwachima, Lada me, Kovat, thank you so madonna. Layama, don't do them Kiva in Songora. Yet it dirta, Kamatuena. Yasa Luashawan Jujua, Telechine Kangalonjus. Nichisuta, don't do the case on any Kaichia Kagomara. Corale and the way you marry Shandachi Shane, Koyaka Mar, Toshike Mardo. Getting dear than Zimba Machina. Yasa Loya Shawan Jujua, Telechine Kangalon Jurus. Yang what is sona?
Trong nhập trung luận ngài Nguyệt Xứng thầy có dạy như thế này: bây giờ khi bạn có được tự do, gặp cái hoàn cảnh thuận tiện, nhưng nếu bạn không lợi dụng lại để cho mất tự do, để rơi vào các cái đọa xứ, thì khi ấy ai sẽ kéo bạn lên trở lại? Nên tất cả chúng ta đều đã tái sinh trong nhiều cõi trời, cõi người, có khi sinh vào loài vật hay là những cõi khác. Thực ra khi mà nhận lấy thân và bỏ lấy thân này để tái sinh thì chúng ta hoàn toàn không có một cái quyền để tự do lựa chọn nơi cái cảnh giới mình sẽ đến. Nên ngày hôm nay mình có được thân người quý báu và có được tự do gặp cái hoàn cảnh thuận lợi và có đủ điều kiện để giải thoát. Nếu như chúng ta không nắm giữ cơ hội này, có nghĩa là nắm giữ là làm thế nào để chúng ta nắm được, để không cho rơi vào những cái cảnh giới thấp hơn, để nắm giữ cơ hội này để tu tập, để sinh vào cõi trời, cõi người, để thoát khỏi ác đạo. Nếu có cái thân người, cơ hội tự do này mà chúng ta không nắm lấy cơ hội một cách chắc chắn, để cho không rơi đọa vào, để không bị đọa lạc vào những cái địa ngục ngạ quỷ súc sinh, thì khi mà đã rơi vào các loại xứ rồi, giống như sinh vào loài vật hay là sinh vào những cảnh giới thấp, thì chúng ta sẽ không có một cái năng lực nào khác, cũng không có thể không có năng lực trí tuệ kém cỏi, và cũng không thể dùng để lời nói để diễn đạt. Thì khi ấy ai sẽ là người kéo bạn lên trở lại?
Tôi sợ. Tôi xuống ra cả số rồi. Để trả nó xuống cái đó. Cho nên thằng đó ngồi mi bao chứ. Có ra về thuyền về yêu này nè. Thuyền gì càng cái chán để về cấp thì là số trả ra xin đi ba. Trong này ba tiêu mà tụi nó xuống cái đó. Anh có lùng bê tông bê chứ. Có ra cái thuyền về trò đã càng cái message liya. Anh mấy cái chú lạc qua càng ba sang mà chú tâm chứ xa xuống đó. Anh có bao nhiêu này ta thằng đó chạy cái ông mà ra số đó. Ở trên này xí. Mi bao de số tanda nganzo bao này số cari chene jigen chima pa nghe xong là mấy cô thάρ바 đã tham gia chimba có mà cari thâu này thì thâu cái chú sai rồi wa ở đi mà sao sẽ sao na nghe xong thì chỉ cái xong này bao de Thabkhe tamba đã chịu rồi in chú ta cái gì còn sao thì rồi đấy cái chuyện của mà rồi ở trên này số ra ko ở milu thâu bát thì toàn đã đem bát chene ở chima là đã mấy cô mà thâu bát chido sewa pa rồi 얘네 타로 토베치도 다음에 보다 니리 차달라 소바 공중가지를 소바 니모도서 강용용지 마바 얘네 산제지 고바 토베치도 라레 시에게 주었지마도네 잠바다 니지 라소바라 대화다 트레나서 동에다 트레나서 심지어 컨디션이면이야 니리 차다메나 삼사 루티 대두 통두 가도 이나고 삼로 다시네 강가 주요르도 소수 삼로야 다해지로 어디 손자 텐데 밀리터리 레지 토바데 단단 덴바 산제지 고반시 토버샤스 대체도 아니 준준을 소바 최사모 장주 셈다 동리도에 따와다 상마송고도 어디 때불이야 태바시 이 삼로다 야내야도 냠슬랑게 이삼 산제지 고반 토베치도 심지어 탐지기 단 주통기게 그것이 연대 군대지 가서 교회에서 시도 어다 준줄이야 төсөм 코스치기 인섬 운로세에 때문에 셈바시오시.
So sorry, I didn't have my microphone on for the last English. So here, the verse from Chandrakirti says that at this time where we have autonomy and all of the conducive conditions, if we fail to take advantage of this, then falling into the lower realms, how could we possibly gain such a situation again? So here, sort of combining that with the next thing that he said, there's an example also of like, if you're a sort of heroic person and you're in your own land with all of the resources you could possibly need, if you don't take advantage of that good sort of situation, the conditions may come about where you're like bound up and thrown into a totally empty place. And if you were to be found in such a situation, there's no way that you can make any progress, defeat your enemies, do anything really. And so we need to try to work to make our life meaningful while we have this kind of situation, because it's not guaranteed that we will gain this again in the future. Again, as that verse says, if we don't sort of prevent ourselves from falling into the lower realms, then we don't have the ability to get back out of that. So here we need to, at the very least, again, abandon harming others, try to avoid that sort of activity with our body, speech, and mind that is inflicting harm on others, and reduce our afflictive emotions, recognizing that ignorance and our anger and attachment and so forth are the source of all of our sufferings. We should do as much as we are able to reduce and eliminate those kinds of afflictions. And then, even though we might not be at the point yet where we can totally sort of cherish others more than ourselves, we should strive to develop love and compassion as much as we are able to. If we really understand this, then any sort of interaction, any time that we are working with our mind or interacting with others can become an opportunity to train in the Dharma. So, in that way, we should think that at the highest level, we're wishing to be able to attain that state of Buddhahood, the state in which we've eliminated all faults and developed all good qualities. And so, with that kind of motivation, we're going to set our intention for listening to these teachings.
Semi baya ta minde se ege sem taba chibu rawa yengenge number sheba de ayin se de kasarba ta sem meba bembo ta de bat na shin shirben de batia ani mare se ora semi baya ta me des semeba chiru be de be de tuba bembo rawa ye se tia ta mare se ora semi ni che ponse semena ani bumba kawa na shi sato na shi de ora semena kawa bumba na shi samluta ya mere ti mena ni ta re mare se ora semi ni che ponso shis kira ta bembo de semi o marwa tu tuba ora se ora kawa bumba na shi sato na shi shin na shi ra semi o mara semena ani kar ta re mare se ora semi ni che ta re mare semena ta sha cho ne ni bumba kawa to ta re du re se ora so shi 근데 샘단 댐베 싫어. 나야 출래자거라. 예 코란다 샘비와 마르다 얘나 샘단 댐베 샘바스그라 샘바. 샘바데다 저와제제 네 거야. 내가 제토그레세. 샘단 맨데바네 샘단 댐바 차토그레세 거라. 샘바데 샘바 삼로타야 요베테단 저와제네. 둔디스코 저마 보시거라. 저와제네 세거라. 네. 저와제네 네 거. semdan dembe ko chere dule sosa yonde semdan dembe chere chule je yonde koranda semyo mar de semdan demba semba de da jawa che ne ko semdan dembe jawa che gre sero no yonde semdan dembe chere she na sa o de ne tangbo she a de pembure sheba meba de ta sheba yoba cha so ke ma shen ge cha so te ne takba re mare ne juan du do an jigba re se jigba ran shi che re se kran sim a de pembo ye takba ye se de jima so ase ambu se me ba de ta che ma ya se ba tan drawa che ne se me ba jur so ase ne me da ba re do ase gora o te so sha ne kes ma shi lap sa ya
So here, then again, beginning with setting our motivation, thinking that we're listening to these teachings on the guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life, here, again, thinking that we are doing so in order to attain the state of Buddhahood, wherein we've eliminated all faults, developed all good qualities, in order to be of benefit to all sentient beings. So here, we're now on verse 68. Well, actually, I think we read through that. And so this is, again, refuting those kinds of other philosophical views of a self, including what came before with like the Samkhyas, And now the refutation is of the Mimamsakas. So these are non-Buddhist schools. The Samkhyas were saying that there was some sort of a self that was conscious, a consciousness. And here they are asserting that the self is substantially existent. It's something that is material. So this with no mind is the self. It's a substantially existent, atomically established with particles, is what they assert as being the self. So here, the first half of the verse as a refutation to that says, that which is not conscious is not I, because it lacks consciousness, just like cloth and so on. So if you say that the self or the I is something other than consciousness, then basically anything, any material thing could become the I, which is an absurd sort of a consequence. So here they come back by then saying, if you counter that it is conscious, this self is conscious, since it is conjoined with consciousness, then it would follow that the non-conscious entity would vanish. So here they respond by saying, well, it's not the case that the self has consciousness. It's material, but it's joined with volition or with mind. And in that way, then has the ability to think and desire things and be conscious. So this is the way that they try to respond to that kind of absurd conclusion by saying, well, no, the self becomes conscious by becoming conjoined with awareness or with volition. And so here, the response to that is, well, then that undermines your assertion that such a self is permanent. If it becomes conjoined with consciousness, then its fundamental nature has changed. And thereby, the kind of proposition that the self is permanent is then not tenable. So here we had read through this verse last time, and this is again a refutation of the Mimamsaka view of a material self.
Ani juwa meba takpa ina se wara, jite tala yurme naase. Sembe de la chish ani sembe de jawa chene kirange, taa de chida shingiri se soa, kare chekwe me shemba, semda demba regri se soa. Ko takpa ina juwa dra yo mare, kyuda kengi kola juwa tanga tu mane, sembe de jawa chene tila taa de keba kandu re, kandu mare chera. Chishi chete kanya chik mare, sheba ina ani midaba re do, juwa do soa. Ambush samlutan mission bichil shima samlutan shingi chaswa. Then duce tabarig marwasura. Sembete la chishiche, sembate cola, roba caricen, chishiche, and Juakan and dry or maresha. Gare tabar wasser, tabain and Juan drawing any medawa de wasura. There is semi charger was a current thought the semban meduase. Legace to marwasera, Chauche gave Amara, Semni Omara, tabar de ora. Ina namka de dying saw Nashimaru Sera. Namka de dying Shandu, the Lagan Geche Umaru, Geshe Shengumar, Keto Kumar, in Tamayes Chen, Namka Tabare, Namka de Tatu Juris dying selection, the Chibare to Asgora. Namka Datu Chebra Juris. Oh, yeah, teach social.
So then this continues below with the continued kind of refutation of this position by saying that in verse 69, moreover, if the self is not subject to change, then what is the use of its consciousness? So again, the Mimamsakas are asserting that the self is material, is permanent and unchanging. It's like atomically established and yet unchanging, not subject to any sort of transformation. So then what would be the use of having, and it's literally volition, like having that kind of intention, being conjoined with consciousness is in order to perform actions or engage with objects, which are impermanent things. And so, for such a self that is supposed to be unchanging and sort of not subject to any kind of transformation, then what is the use of consciousness? How could that be aided or helped or transformed by consciousness? That would undermine, again, the idea that it's somehow permanent. And so then continuing in the second half of this, it says, thus lacking consciousness and being separate from activity, space could be regarded as the self. So here, if they still try to push this and say that, well, the self is inert, it's not the thing that is acting, it's endowed with volition, but it doesn't actually have consciousness in that sense. It's unconscious and it doesn't do those activities. Well, then to say something like that, you could thus assert that space, something that is completely inert and has no activity or volition, is also the self. So here, that's the kind of absurd consequence that would follow if they try to continue to say that no, the self is material and it's not endowed with consciousness really, or it isn't transformed by consciousness. If that's the case, then you could equally say that space is the self.
Ne sheba mege sheba nawe sheba sayarabu tindre chi daadu shabiyo marwa. Ne tsoa dewa dungye sayarabu simju kondru nga jese tezu daa marwa. Daa meerus daa yoris tezu la tene daa ures. Tezu la tene ene paa daa daa re. Tene daa bo samri shaa ures. Ina ne chik daa yin sayayo marwa. Ina tezu la tene paa daa ne daa shaa ures. Daa ka chawa chaya yora. Le saaya yore. Drebu tidu nyoya yore. Tindriji mada taa takbo lega mejinga juni taa si chawa ke chimudo an tindriji taa kele malike mudo asiyora. O taa kundu chi tsene rago do samjene taa tsegi yora ani tseti shibati yinseru sobu yinseru chila gura. Nangba chene taa di tsene raya ke omura tene takwa azum shawura. Sobu la tene paa tagu yore, chowa la tene tagu yore, kondu la tene tagu yore. Iri ku kondu sete shaas. Tere ko kibu mido se, semba kibu do tere ko kabu do se. Kumbu nga la ten jen, tele tene pa taa ne, taa shaa kurwa. Ine sokwi lega chene, taa ki lega chigore, sembi lega chene, taa ki lega chigore. Yesu kange chawa cheba de, taa ki chawa cheba dugara. Sem kewa da tikba samlutana, iti yongudwa. Liu yi kiti ki chawa chene, taa ki chawa cheba dugudwa. Tene takwa sam, ten jen leba ni chongas, nangba ke. Chikbu maare, cho tamche tagare. Sokbu lu sinaya, lu tokto chi yo ma, rawa dhutuba chi yo maare. Zambuli si tokto chi tengi doa nga zo, rawa we tokto chi ke yo maare. Yuten kyang tson ramandra kanga tso dero. Yu ruru chebde nga zo su tom gyabche o, di zambuli re ri ri re se lapshe yo ra. Kuna ri ri se che rawa ne ke yo maare, tren re 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 ma do yo maare. Yunga bu kanga chikbare, tanda taali chani shek yo ra. Ade kaya chambu sonza nga sam nga rawa chinchin tiwa nga kya kanga yungu isa nga rawa tinte chiwa ma re se tene takwa sam re se de ene namji mi kashe liya nga zo nga sam rawa chi de te sam rita de jikba kiri wara toz mandi na ta nga li shibu chi yungu sam ki wara kaa che sam kira o nga mena nga she sa re se kek men ke re chindu si wara tangbu tongbe suri duwa na me ke mara chawa chi wara yudu nyungu duwa semliya chi chundi tewa danga tungya nganzu sorgudwa. Tenchen rehori shunga samla taa shaakuru esan taa di midakwa sobu kechi ya sembu che roba che udwa. Semde te udwa, choha de te udwa. Sobu naga tsaadang tuzu lungdu kange lega che udwa. Tanda nganzu mirwa, mi sonza mi liu la tenchen rehni taa shaakura. Yaku midan rawa che tuyani sobu danga semnyi din rawa meba che semde chamu che chen roshani 미마이마 차로라 시바 참무 차고도 오 티실라면 리바샤라 야 그래서
So here, this kind of refutation is for those sort of non-Buddhist schools that identify, that point to something as being the self, either this kind of consciousness or form, material things. But for Buddhists, particularly the Prasangikas, the self is something that is merely dependently designated on a collection of various components. So we have like our form and our feelings, our consciousness and discrimination and compositional factors, all of our various sense consciousnesses, various afflictions, anger, and so forth. And it's only in dependence upon that that one designates a self. There is someone that experiences suffering, experiences happiness, does activities, and reaps the results of those. But it's not as though there is something that you can point to among those various components that exists as the self in and of itself. Now, for non-Buddhists, they say that, well, if you search, you have to find something that you can point to and say, this is the self. But again, for Buddhists, this is something that is merely dependently designated. Independence upon, say, someone's anger. We say, oh, he is angry. That person is not their anger, but they're designated independence upon that. Or on their form. When we do a particular activity with our body, we say, oh, I'm doing this activity. And if we do virtuous activities, if we do positive things, we will gain positive results. We will experience positive results. And if we do non-virtue, we will experience suffering, both physical and mental. And so it's not just the I or the self that appears to exist in this kind of autonomous, independent, self-existent way, but it is all phenomena. The entire world, like we think, oh, this world, it sort of exists in and of itself, not aware of how it's something that is designated independence upon the conglomeration of many different atoms and so forth. We speak like, oh, this world is round, as if it somehow were just round by itself, as though it didn't depend upon all kinds of causes and conditions. And so holding to such an autonomous, like independent existence in and of itself, whether it is of our own person or other phenomena, this is really a mistaken way of viewing things. And so for some, when they hear these kinds of teachings, there's a sort of like fear that comes like, oh, I'm totally non-existent. I don't exist at all. But we know from our experiences, we engage in activities, we experience pleasant and unpleasant results. We do things and we gain the kind of results from that. And so we have there is an I, but it doesn't exist in the way that we think it does, in the way that we perceive it to have this kind of autonomous, independent existence. So right now we are an I designated on a human body, but this body and mind is something that is temporary. Eventually, the body and mind will separate. This body will disintegrate. We will cast that off, and our very subtle, subtle mind will continue on. There's a continuum of that. And so the self that we speak of is not something that can be identified among those parts, but rather it is something which is merely designated in dependence upon our aggregates.
그래서 망부증 간주하고도 강바 다마를 고다마를 Sotamare, Tadamare, Sitatunga Hakudo, Hamakuni, Shigi Omarda, Rao Tachi Yonase, that's any Rakurwa, Rangune Yona, Takadris, Tina Chisegura, that's any Diriven, Stisegura. Soputi Marwase, Lapa de Marwase, This Soa de Marwase, Shiba de Marwase, Condru de Marwase, Shibena la Medua, Soguna la Meduase, Acarese, Tam Meduesene, Yora, Yesula Teneta, Rao etati Yomarese, Rao etati Yona, Tatsene Ragura, Takagresegura, Di Marwa, Di Maresigura. When the Kangbola, what to the time, but to Hakudo. Lüdi tamar nge lü sigdo ngadu loga shagdo nge sem ro nge chora tinde su nge tinde samgi dushi de marwa indiko ele los achi tit member hagodo ina tedal tene tagore chokba de besen chokba de mare chokba la tene ta tagora pungunga de chokba la tene ene ta tagora shingna mambu chosune shingna mambu chokba la tene ene 낙차에서 봤다고 요라. 어디 내시 컴퓨터에 강가 찍버 봐. 양라 마부 초네 초벌 때는 봤다 하셔도 그래서 레레 레가 치도 컴퓨터 레가 치기 시작으로 레레 컴퓨터 말어. 지켜 쇼스나 텔레전 쇼샤사우라 코드 말어. 자 때네 딱 와서 뭐 강가다 그래. 어디 상부터 마다야 라바타 마르타 다마르스도 아주 마시 버치 쉐그르 세티 하고 요라. 다 라오에 다 주네 그그래 세체네 디마르와 다카반도 세디 라오 하민도세 다 카르메르바 마르 텐네 딱바세 텐제 데바리 중아레 소라 텐제 데바리 중아가 텐네 똥반이도 셰스도 마보지 속발레 텐네 르파탄 치샤고라 이 손자 랑웨네 트베 똥바 랑웨네 똥바 라와드 트베 똥바 랑게 ngoye 똥바 라오에 똥바서 어디시고라 똥반이 똥바 롭트지 셈리 차나야 그래 어딘데 그래야 인데
So here we can understand like when we talk about the various sort of parts of the body not being the self, like we can understand, oh yeah, my foot is not me, my head is not me, my teeth are not me. Like going through the various sort of parts of the body, we can identify that each of those parts is not the I, is not the self. It's no, like there's nowhere within the body or the mind that we can point to something that exists as this self. But it's not as though by going through in that way you prove its non-existence, but rather we prove that there's no autonomously existent I. It's some sort of I that exists in and of its own right. Because if it did, we would have to be able to find it through such analysis. However, we can't actually find something. It seems as though there is a self that's like somehow separate or apart from those aggregates. We talk about like my body, my mind, my feelings, as if there was some sort of I that were apart from those that possessed them. Or maybe we think that the I is the collection of our aggregates, but that too, it's not just the collection, but it's something that is designated in dependence upon that collection of aggregates. Like in the same way that when we have many trees, we designate on that basis, oh, that's a forest. It's not as though each of those things is a forest, but rather the forest is something that is designated in dependence upon that collection. And so too with every other kind of object, like a computer is is something which is designated upon a collection of many parts. And when one of those parts breaks down, we say, oh, the computer is broken, and so forth, even though the computer is not that part, but is rather something which is designated in dependence upon that. And so what is being negated is not the thing itself, but some sort of autonomous self, autonomous kind of existence. And so here, as Nagarjuna says, whatever is dependent is dependently designated, that is explained to be empty. So that which is empty of that kind of autonomous self is dependently designated. It exists as a mere dependent designation, as does our self or our I.
Ni nyingji chenpo komsikido, semje le nyingji kiya yuwa maru, semje yuwa maru asigara kya charas. Tanda konzo samlu na namgyu nganzu samba nashi, nga sidi rangwa chi samlu kogudo, ti mena samgara, nga mena sidi rangwa ya nga di mena si, ti mato samlu koyo, namgyu nganzu samlu na yuwa nga chiduwa, nga si tra, si nye, si, sidi tra ina rangwa ni yuwa tra si, nye ina rangwa ni nye do shirwa, nga sidi rangwa chi samlu kogudo. Ngazu tonga nashi namju samba nashi te yo ma resi yo ra. Inde yo ma nga yo yo re te ngazu samba nashi yo ma resi yo ra. Nga me na si yo ra, ta me.
Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
Mo tudara chigun sema Torendana tamjete ma so ike chelarati Onjondende ma pamande mala cha tselo Chanzandra mandare pemo Tudara chigun sema Torendana tamjete ma so ike chelarati Onjondende ma pamande mala cha tselo Chanzandra mandare pemo Tudara chigun sema Torendana tamjete ma so ike chelarati
Tudarai Jikun Sama Ture Donam Tam Chetama So Ayike Chela Raptu Om Janan Dema Pamadro Malacha Selo Chesendra Mantare Pam Tudarai Jikun Sama Ture Donam Tam Chetama So Ayike Chela Raptu
Onjundende mampamandra
Malacha Selo
Chanandra mandare
Pamo
Tudara
Chicken Sama
Torendanam
Tamjedama So
Soaike chelara
Onjadende
Onjundende
Mapamando Malacha Selo Chesendruma Tare Pamo Tudara Chicken Sam Ture donam tam chete ma so ike chela raptu Om jana nema pamadro malacha selo Chesendro matare pamo Tudara ishikun sam Ture donam tam chete ma so ike chela raptu Om jana nema pamadro malacha selo Tare pamo tudora ichi kun san ma ture donam tanjetam so ike chela raptu om janan dema pamado malacha selo Tare pamo tudara ichi kun san ma ture donam tanjetam so ike chela raptu Romala Chaselo, Chasendroma Tare Pomo, Chikun Sema, Ture Donam Samjete Ma, Soa Ige Chela Raptu, Om Chandendema Pamadro Mala Chaselo, Chasendroma Tare Pomo, Tutara Chikun Sem. Ture donam tanjete ma so ike chela raptu Om janan dema pamadro malacha selo Cheseno matare pamo Tudara ichikun sema Tamjete ma so ike chela raptu Om janan dema pamadro malacha selo Roma Tare Pamo, Tutara Ichikun Sama, Ture Donam Tamjeteo, Soa Yige Chela Raptu, Om Jamnan Dema Pamadro Malacha Selo, Tare Pamo, Tutara Ichikun Sama, Ture Donam Tamjeteo, Soa Yige Chela Raptu, Om Janan Dema Pamadro Malacha Selo Chasendro Matare Pamo Tudara Ichikun Sama Tamjete Ma So Ike Chela Raptu Om Janan Dema Pamadro Malacha Selo Chasendro Matare Pamo Tudara Ichikun Sama Tamjete ma so yige chela raptu Om janan dema pamadro malacha selo Tare pamo tutara ije kun sarma Ture donam tamjete so yige chela raptu Om janan dema pamadro malacha selo Chesendro matare pamo Tutara ije kun san Ture donam tam jete ma so ye jela rab tu. Chanan de ma pa ma dro ma la jaselo. Jaselo ma tare pa mo tu da i che kun ma. Te ma so ye jela rab tu. Om Jana Nema Pama Do Malaja Selo Jasendo Matare Pomo Tutara Iji Kunsan Ture Donam Tam Jere Ma So Yige Jela Raptu Nema Pama Do Malaja Selo Jasendo Matare Pomo Jekun Sama Tura Donam Tam Jede Ma So Yige Jela Raptu Dema Pama Do Malaja Selo Jasendo Matare Pamo Tutarai Jekun Sama Donam Tam Jede Ma So Yige Jela Raptu Pamadru Malaja Selo Jasendo Matare Pamo Tutarai Jekun Sama Ture Donam Tam Jedem So Yige Jela Raptu Om Jonan Dema Pamadru Malaja Selo Tutarai Jekun Sama Ture Donam Tam Jedem So Yige Jela Raptu Jonan Dema Pamadru Malaja Selo Duma Tara Pamo Tutarai Jekun Sama Ture Donam Tam Jedema So Yige Jela Raptu Om Jonan Dema Pamadru Malaja Selo Tare Pamo Tutarai Jekun Sama Ture Donam Tam Jedema So Yige Jela Raptu Om Jonan Dema Pamadru Malaja Selo Tare Pamo Tutarai Jekun Sama Ture Donam Tam Jedema So Yige Jela Raptu Om Jonan Dema Pamadru Malaja Selo Tare Pamo Tutarai Jekun Sama Ture Donam Tam Jedem So Yige Jela Raptu Om Jonan Dema Pamadru Malaja Selo So Yige Jela Raptu Om Jonan Dema Pamadru Malaja Lo Jasendo Matare Pamo Tutarai Jekun Sam Ture Donam Tam Jedema So Yige Jela Raptu Pamadru Malaja Selo Jasendo Matare Pam Tutarai Jekun Sam Ture Donam Tam Jedema So Yige Jela Raptu Om Jonan Dema Pamadru Malaja Selo Jasendo Matare Pamo Tutarai Jekun Sama Ture Donam Tam Jedem So Yige Jela Raptu Dru Malaja Selo Jasendo Matare Pamo Tutarai Jekun
Okay. So Yige Jela Rab. Today I think it's difficult to fix, so we might be stopped. You know, that the soto and the dish Irisha. And a sunny sure wa. Pejishana. Issue good than a kunyere.
Also,
Okay, we the drama the page 40 60 62 we will I think internet not gonna work. It's still working, we are working, so maybe it's better to stop today. Pandita can rest, then tomorrow Sunday 10 o'clock we have. Okay, so page 46 62, yeah, 62. Amolaga yanda dembe londen kange ratan jejin sodan toran lamba chin tembe meje tamje rabden diva tamje rabdu shiva ngendo tamje chumbani yawa chawa tradun namge nyudon he kwaje dile chawa nyene topche sanje kumban tato dedro te tone chaboch tene payan shen trawa sewa tane tuwa nyejan tembe rabdu sewa dunda ramda teke sine dungen sone namba pa simjen shema namla yango nisum dundong ba june pudun pane pudo jush nodun pane no nanye ton duwa tamje tawa gena meche so so chongyo chi chizun paman drumadan chojo tesun shukwa kyawa seche tamje lakune tangye chake o mendo tukbe ma
Lesta.
la.
Lesta, Mare.
Oh, okay, now it's come. It's working now.
Le Mare.
Let's again.
Le ne shen kamar.
Lare, lare.
La.
Good, much into now.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Not working, so we continue. Okay.
Oh, ah. Vale, let me see. Kadani yemen tabashime.
Nha trích
Kadani yemen ade. Oh, do. Okay. Rigor, kadani yemen ased mare. Oh, din dis hajara. Ta land is wa ralu landing bio. Tani ba land jagro. Jadi tani yemen na jara. Lende deba remete se ta takwa mena. Le ta debu jawate tutu mares. Le sangete debu nyundu yo mare. Debu nyungete le sadu yo mare sora. Le jena ne shikbena kira chana le chasa da kichini bala shiksarwa sora. Sui le son jurshena se. Ni chema debu nyundu sa. Sui le sabna debu de nyungu ware sera. Le sangete yo marwa ni te chidu. Le sabate debu manyu debu nyungete le masabate dude sora. O tisanda kira le debu tek medu. Nga yene nga zu yene tegre ta takba yo se. Le sangete tanda tede yo se. Kyo chima yina kyo dili le sabate kyo chima tala tede yo re. Ta de takba se. Isigdwa. Ya, o tik sona. Tagi lamsare na kanimishi.
So here, I'm not exactly sure where we got cut off, but beginning with verse 70. So again, this is refuting the idea of some kind of a permanent self. So at the beginning of verse 70, one might say that in the absence of a self, there would be no proper relationship between an action and its a result. If the agent vanishes upon having performed an action, who will experience this result? So here, those who assert a kind of permanent self say, well, you Buddhists, with your idea of impermanence, then there would be no connection between the self who creates an action or who does an action and the one who experiences a result, because they're impermanent, they're changing. But for us, we assert a permanent self. So the one who creates an action is going to be the same one that experiences it in a future life. So here, their sort of objection to the Madhyamaka or the Buddhists is that, well, if this agent vanishes, if they are impermanent, the self, then upon having performed an action, who experiences the result then? Who is it? There would be no connection between actions and results. This is the kind of objection that they raise.
Thì cũng không có thật chúng sinh đang bị khổ đau, thì cũng không cần phải phát khởi cái lòng bi đối với chúng sinh. Cho nên họ nghĩ rằng không có cái nghĩa là đồng nghĩa với không có một cái nghĩa tự tồn tại một cách độc lập. Cho nên là không có kẻ thù, không có người thân thì sẽ không có gì cả. Nhưng mà trong Phật giáo nói rằng là nó không có một cái ngã như chúng ta vẫn thường chấp thuận.
So then the response to that, again, that someone asserting that there has to be this permanent kind of person that is the same at the time of engaging in the action and experiencing the result. Well, the response then comes in 71, where it says, since we both agree that an action and its fruition have different bases, and that the self who performs the action does not function at the time of its fruition, is it not pointless to dispute this issue? So here, we both have to assert that the person at the time of performing an action is different than the person at the time of experiencing the result. At the very least, one has to agree that there is a different occasion. There is an occasion where one is performing an action, and then there is a time or an occasion which is later when one experiences the results. Otherwise, there would be the problem that the action and result would have to be simultaneous. If you want to say that it's the exact same sort of person that does the action and experiences the result, and you're not willing to distinguish that there are different occasions of that. So here, continuing into verse 72, it says, it is not possible that the very possessor of the cause can be seen to be endowed with the effect. Meaning, again, that when we do an action, if we say do an action now, the result is something that will come in the future. And if you, this person who wants to assert a permanent self, wants to say that the very one that does the cause is the same exact one who has the effect, then those would have to become simultaneous, which is obviously absurd. We don't see that the ripening of a result comes simultaneous with an action, rather they are sequential. So again, as it says here, it is not possible that the very possessor of the cause, the one who does the action, is the very one endowed with the effect. So both of us have to agree that the person at the time of doing an action is different than at the time of the fruition of that action.
Oh yeah, đó nó cái đó lẽ cả đấy nó ra lúc thì đó, câu số làm cái đó, thì cái đó lẽ cả đấy ở xí đó, cái đó làm cái bao xí nè, không mấy xí đó, anh ấy cái đó cái đó đều cái xí nè, thì cứ chỉ là này tên này số, chế bộ sẽ trở tên xí, còn sao cứ chỉ bảo đấy xí đó, cái này mấy cái lo nhị sư cấp liền. Kuma de ku ya ki she ro ngolo che ra a chema lo ru chu tin ju le so na chim ga ne ta chim tang so na we ko ka re se kong ge ko chi ba ro gyu chi ba ro lu tin ta ga re ku ta wa nyong ge ka sa de gyu chi ba ro ko ke chi gyur so ro ma do nga lo ngab chu yin nga me ko lo ni shu che de nga me sa sa yo ma ro ko gyu chi ba ro lu ji gyu chi ba ro 강사 규칙 봐서라 깨지게 이나 규칙 봐라 아주지 나와지 지나 니마레레레 제제 니마 숨주도 수 dom든 나와지 수도 균식이라 돼 균데 균진식이라 균진수도 차시에도라 깨지 니마지 니 숨줄 나와지 수도 나와종이라 로지식도 돼 로데 균이로와 나와데 균이로와 현다데 균진식이라 그래서 균다 균진 어디도 가서라 류기 균칙 바로와 풍비 균칙 바로와 샘기 균칙 바로와 내가 대대 로니 수제바 대대 대어 말와 얘네 고 소부 다가래 샘 다가래 강사 집 바로와 고 교르 제침 바로와 고 배짬이 제베나 아니 랍초라 짠 배매서나 고 교르게지 수도 게지 대게 말에 고 교르 우리서 와라 랑서 대게 말에 내가 드나시 대게 말아 내가 드나시 때는 로촌주 부 logic dengue de aga dege nani gege marwa gedo do lu gedo re seme tagna shya meda chagra inde ko gyun chikba sonza tere pungge gyun kansa koran gyurwa keranye ma de lecha san Drepung yong de sera dena shi kyawa chima chashina chendela lesa chendela Drepung ma yong de kyawa chima yong ge shina ya ko pungge gyun chikba rwa 강사 된 줄게 제 센데 풍부샤 양신 규제 현다적 류랑제 연구하러 자 풍비 균직 바래 샘기 균직 바래 대선자 그 교요 말에서 오라 균선에 깨진가지 숨용게들 균세 그래 깨지치니 숨을 지요나 아니 균로와 숨 전에 균로와 찍마도 면에 균세야 요 말아 깨지 찍마도 근데 가사데 배 균디 조세기 요 말아 깨지기 직수도단 당부 예반나 신이바 대게 요 말아 알아서 하고 그래 삼루다나 우단 자통 지 속에 나로 난차도 간가 내가 저거라 당부 내가 전개도 대샤부터 정말 내가 맞아 대금도 대야 사바사바 내가 전에 사바사바 끼기도 소대가를 선부치 대되고 깨지깨지를 샘규를 나신 교구 있어라 선바서야 되고 깨지깨지 선배 교들이 할기 내가 선배 교들이 마음반에 교신다 먹어 제고 선시 대금 말아 이 손자고 깨지깨지 그 교루요래 깨지도도 차례 균제대로 아니 균세야 돼 되게 수 계신가지 숨쉬가 두든게야 로진다원이세라 교원가시세로 그 균직 받치네 간사 규칙과 손자 대가마 싹바데 가마 싹베 갑기 어로와 깨치티 매나야 균치마 요산테 레사야 된 대분용게 간사디 롱그레스거라 어디지 손나디 마시티 람네 이발렌으로 와데 저원 제시 타데다스도 이러왜 좋아 저원 제시 타데다 저와 쟁게 레상게 되던 제분용게 니데시고라 간사니부데 시제 타데레 당몇 개지디 대요 말로 개지 니버체 nga마디 규르바 치마디 제부로 와세 제타데레 제타데 아니 여다 제바 매버려야세 제분용에 내감나 레상게기 간사데 요 말에세라 그러나 만주르체 대요 말와 제바 매버야 우장이가 라투베 그래서 때문에 많이 남디 마서 되는데 대부 당제시 시마요 저래 주유베 두나야로와 주대사베 두나 대부 용화데 요새야데 저라켈레 두고 말했디 통화되는 시마이세 주유투순 대부도 용 말와 내상게데 주르와 대부 용게데 대부로와 인데 코카가 nga마qabli 치마메 치메qabli ngama 매고라 이들 교단 대부니가 뒤치도 주바데 고마로 하시도 어딜 해게도 유인직 받체로 규질란에 떼내서 어디다 뒤 어디라면 규질란에 떼내서 제부 세자돼서 규직과 가사 규직과 손자 nga마들 해 제바 보시고래 이 규직과 가사 치마들이야 대부 롱줘바 보시고래 이때는 딱 봤으면서 그라. 라와도 두 번 찍을 때 먹어 봐도 말와. 어디에 다 랍선에. 되도. 아마도 랍사를 서로 타게.
So here, then the second half of verse 72 continues that again, you can't have the very same person doing the cause that's endowed with the effect in terms of there being simultaneous. Rather, agent and experience are designated depending on their oneness of continuum. So here to give an example, like if someone breaks the law when they're 20 years old and 30 years go by and then they're apprehended when they're like 50 years old, they can't say to get out of it like, oh, no, I didn't do it. That was the person at 20 years old, because they're of the same continuum. And so it is with the case of a single continuum that we can posit logically that an earlier moment of that continuum is what leads to a latter moment of the same continuum experiencing that kind of result. And so here, it's not possible for the time of creating the cause to be simultaneous with the effect of that cause, but rather the self, which is designated upon this continuum, is then the one that experiences, because there is that single continuum. You can posit the relationship between the cause and result. Like, for example, we have the continuity of time. So we can talk about a month. That's sort of a continuum that is made up of various parts. Each day that goes by, and those days are made up of hours, which are made up of seconds, and so forth. And the continuum is the same, but it's not as though that is remaining static, but rather it's changing moment to moment to moment. So the person is designated upon the continuum of the aggregates, the continuum of the subtle mental consciousness, and so forth. And all of these, what makes up a continuum has to have at least 3 moments, a sort of past, present, and future, and continue to go along. If you just have one moment, you can't have a continuum. But it's not as though that continuum remains for a single moment as stable or static or unchanging, but rather it's changing moment to moment to moment. So long as we are alive, we have to continue to change moment to moment. We have to drink water and breathe and all of these various things. It's not as though we just are able to get the causes for being alive and then just remain, but rather we have to continue to depend upon various causes and conditions. And so too, when it comes to the relationship between the self that created an action and the self that experiences the result, it's possible to posit this based upon the oneness of that continuum. So while the exact self that committed the action doesn't remain, it's a latter moment of the same continuum that experiences the result. So therefore, this is logical, this is viable. And so even though it's not the exact same self, we can say, I did this action and now I am experiencing that result, because that I is designated upon the same continuum. But it's not logical for it to be a permanent self, or for somehow the one who's doing the action to be the exact same as the person who's experiencing the result of it.
Dòng tương tục của thời gian, và nên nó vẫn tiếp diễn trong cái dòng tương tục thời gian. Chúng ta thở ra
Mandela, Deda Mao by a Simsera. When the Tanda Yang Kolpa Kawachido. Debe Semde Omara, when the Tiridachina, Case Shinsa and Debe Semde Omar Tanda. Mao be Semde Yonjura. At Tanda Semde or Watanda. Gela Manga Pache, Gela Mashiche, Dete or Atanda. Deda Mao by a Sem, means. Debe semde tande negab de chasen debe semde tamare desar yomare tanda mamba yonju semde sanina yonju semde tamare tanda yomare roa ene deda mamba sem ta mise ade negab yomaro ta rigmaro so ta kolpa yanjas yorda chirubada pase deda mamba sem 다음에 때는 매베신 대베심대 단다 요마르 마음베심대 용주래 예소자 이니 다 말해서 단대 내금나시 근데 계심 다이나 단다 깨네 망가바제 대대게 심대 다인세 나서라 라웨 다인세 키라라베 나서라 이나세 에네 예시 내내 다 매도세 어때요 고개진이 벌로 시도래 이나 때 라웨 당니도 요 말해서 거라 저랑 라웨 당니도 요세 거라 띠요 말해서 에나 간데레스나 에나 추시 동보다 추시 깨레 동보요라 깨레 동보도 파도도 본보를 장도 거부시요라 이내 고 빠바 쉬네 빠바 쉬지 차고지요 말와 어때냐 에나 추시 동보다 내가 차셰 체나 가메바 차고데 차셰 체네 따는 빠바 야마도 동보 차고지요 말와 파도도 동보 차고지요 버서 코랑외네 지에서 소리치와르데 박바시지 바 치마도 요 마트네 시케랑 다데 아다베스 다이스 딱 맞지고 라와도 주베 다이스나야 어디 차샤치나 세네 제제 되는 라고 말했어 소보다 셈다 차샤르르르잖아 라고 말했어 라에 다지요나 악세바 제세바 디레스 니에스 거래 라문에요나 이거 말했어 오라 그나 출신 동보다 차샤치는 가메바 이신 넘버를 제바이 제나 다자야다 메서 대시 다스나시 다데 라와도 주바치나 아니 제바체네 제고래 넘버 제바제 랍도 제바체바예 이 제나 다 라고 말해 출신 동보다 직바래 다자야 제나 다자 양다 메서 양다 바주바 당다 바주바데 요 말해서도 야 어디 랍시나
Câu kệ số 73.
And so then moving into the next few verses, verse 73 and 74, again, sort of dealing with the one who wants to point to something and identify that as the I. When we look at the mind, like the mind of the past is gone. It's already disintegrated. And a future mind is yet to come. It hasn't yet arisen. So it says here in the first half of 73, the past or future mind is not the I, for it is not found. The mind of the past is already gone, and the mind of the future is yet to come. Those can't be found. But it is also isn't logical for this present mind to be the self, as it says. Moreover, the present mind is not the self, for if it were, upon its passing, the self too would not exist. So if it is the case that one wants to identify like the mind as being the self, it can't be the past minds that have already disintegrated, nor the future ones that are yet to arise. But it's not the case that the mind of now has a nature such that it remains, that it stays. In the second moment, it will disintegrate and be gone. And so too, when we examine in this way, moving to verse 74, when the trunk of a banana tree is cut into pieces, there is nothing left over. Just so, the I is not found to be really existent when sought after analytically. So we might come across like a banana tree or a plantain tree where it seems like this is a really solid thing. There should be a solid core in there. And as you peel back the various leaves, it comes that there's nothing there whatsoever. There's no essence. There's no core, that solid, hard thing that there seemed to be. So if there were either a permanent, unitary, sort of autonomous self, or the self that appears to us innately, as if it had its kind of its own autonomous existence, it were existent in its own right, then it would have to be findable upon analysis. When we look throughout the aggregates, we would have to be able to point to something that is that self.
강사 균체 주요 말아. 강사의 계지 지수 계지 때는 균체는 대 제일 고랑 균용에 매나. 근데 그 치료가 쉐베 견디 주고라. 내사서도 시부를 다시 한다요 말아. 그 요르제 강사 균체 버와 대대요라. 근데 그 천딜이나 아마 제바데 치면 제부 용해요라. 요한에 깨와시나 공감에 사바데 치면 용해요라. 강사 균체 버와. 균체 버스라. 말아도 따다 발란스니 규타데스라 yundi taderwa. Gyu chikpa sonzani kyo chikma resigora. Tena nga zo namji kadi lo de sigiwa. Lo de kechi zoguyora höde. Ma zoni pene pesha rugmarwa. Kechi ruguyora. Hine chigi tu lega chigi tuwa nga zo pesha lo ere nagun tiche. Anga chawa che tugudwa. Jigda kechi rere jigiwara mato kechi nga mate lo höde. Chima degi na ene roson rugmarwa. Pene lo rugmarwa. Ina ko kechi roi na kyun tuyu che tedu lega che tugudwa. Lo kechi jigi wara, kechi jigi manen roson do mara, lo kate pa na chibare, tambu chipara ta nima nyinze para ni de chibwa sigra, ipene do wara. O ti na shi ko kansa kyun chibwa. Kechi mare se de kechi ko sa kigi che kyun di pa jurge che de wara. Manjur che de mara. Juro mebe che de mara. Karesne ngobo kanga de judan kenge wanga ya de wara. Judan kenge wanga ya kansa ene sabuchi de wara. Jishin nase na judan kenge kanka wanga ya ko kadu sanshi de wara. Inde ko kyuhi ngama che ke sara de takma che de mara. Yanja kyugin chigi chigaran, kechi ngama chigi chima yungu chigara. Oya teach sona andira.
So here again, there are those that would claim that the problem with the Buddhist assertion of this kind of momentariness is that the self would perish, would not exist. But here, the response to that is that there is a continuum. That continuum continues throughout lives, but that continuum itself is composed of moments of disintegration, of this constant disintegration. So when we speak of a single continuum that passes through various lives, we can talk about creating a cause and experiencing the result and so forth. Whereas something like an ox and a cow, those have different continua, and they are not able to transfer those kinds of results. So here, a good example of this is like electricity. Although something is perishing moment to moment, it can still have the kind of appearance of solidity or being solid. In the same way that when we say turn on a light, that's actually something that is changing moment to moment. It seems like that light is burning and it's sort of static and solid, but it's not the case because we're paying for that. We have to pay for as much as we take from that electrical current. And so the continuum of the self is continuous in the way that light, when we turn it on, it seems as though it's like solid and static, but it isn't actually. It doesn't remain unchanging in any way. Otherwise, it would be the same sort of cost to just turn on our light once versus have it on all day. But rather, it's something that depends upon all of these kinds of causes and conditions aggregating in order for us to produce light. And so too, when it comes to the self, it is dependent upon all these kind of causes and conditions. The continuum of the self is something that remains, but it's composed of moments that are perishing and another cause and condition is involved. So here, this is how we should understand the way to posit the connection between actions and their results is not that there is something that can be pointed to and found, but rather the self is something which is designated on that continuum of ever-changing moments.
Ne sanje ji koban top che che yora. O tezu teg medu sigora. Kera da mena sigora. Ne da mena simje mena sigora. O tene ningji komne sanje ji koban top de simje le ningji koba de teg mares. Ning che sa ge simje medu asore kera chena. Onge da medu ase. Ning che sa ge simje medu tungen yonge ge simje medu asigora. Ralu til pa le ja yora. Ale tangbu ti tsu la gudwa. Ningji gomba tegmana. Kete semje yue mena sula ningji chashi na se. Kera sula ningji kumgore, ningji chenpo kumgore se, tangnim kumgore se, jamba kumgore se mamu shega doa se gora. Sula Niji Kongura, Tana Messido. I may round I mess, Namjunga to somebody nation, other Simja Messido. I said, the Tajinchikawa Kongura, Siora. Yet the Simja Yemena, Sula Niji Chashanas, Chokudwa, or Tambu Tichilana. No one want to land Javra.
Câu kệ số
So then here we come to secondly, and these are faults that are being pointed out by non-Buddhists towards the Buddhists. So first was that there would be no connection between cause and result. And secondly is that there would be no sentient beings for whom to meditate on compassion. If there is no being that experiences suffering, then how is there, is it that we develop compassion? If there are no beings whatsoever is the way that they are thinking, then there's no one, to meditate on compassion and no one for whom to develop compassion. This is the sort of fault that they are trying to point out. So they say in the first half of 75, you might ask, if no sentient being is found, if no self is found, toward whom would one feel compassion? And so who is it that we are meditating on equanimity and love and compassion for if there is no such self?
Sula Chashina, Sula, Tapala, Debutant to Kalambe. Debutant to Kalambe, Mumbe Tabakaiba, Osido. Debutant to Kalam, Debutobetundo, Sanje Yakoba Tobetundo, Ninji Komgura Chamba Komgura sit in the Shagora. Debu Tarvata, Tamja Kimbe Koba Tobechedo, Chamba Nizila Soba Komgura Shagora. Debutanto, and Kalambesura. Mumbe Tabakaibe Simjes. Mumba Maripala Soba Tezoge. Rawanto Mana, Rawanto Yoba, Taban Jurve Simjes to the Lamendura. Taban Juve, Mumbe, Maripa, Rawan, Mabala, Rawan, Yoba, Taban Juve Simjela meaning Nijikum Biores. It is an anti-gode. Mumbe Tabakaibe Simje, Netanya to Yobatele, Niji Mikwares. Hanye to Kerana, she turned up by Yoba, Rawan to Yoba Simjel me or mother. Umbu talk about the part and talk about some Simjet till a mine. Ninji Kumgara. Koyatonga ore, something when you're done into Samutane, Ninji Kumgara, I teach you Lam Samba.
So, in response to this idea that there would be no object of compassion, here, or object of one's compassion, it then says in the second half of verse 75, in response, for practical purposes or for the sake of attaining liberation and omniscience, one feels compassion for beings who are imputed by acknowledged delusion or by delusion. So, in order to develop our love and compassion, one observes these beings that are merely designated as sentient beings out of our delusion. So it's not as though there are beings that have this kind of autonomous, independent existence, which they seem to have to our sort of ignorant appearances, but rather it is those conventionally existent sentient beings, those that are merely designated with our delusion, that we meditate on compassion for. So for these other schools, they would think that there need to be ultimately really truly existent beings for whom one develops compassion. But here the response is that it is actually for those that are just merely designated out of delusion.
Inaya temper trouble she simply manner, simply meva mare, then a tabo some simply ore, yellow meaning any news you come ores, what in the ora. Yeah.
cái chỗ mà ngu si nên giải lập chỗ này rất là khó.
So here, where it says are merely designated out of delusion, this we shouldn't understand this that sentient beings are like completely non-existent, but rather too are grasping at the self of a person and phenomena. We think that they have this kind of well, in this case persons, but as other persons phenomena have a kind of independent self. That's what we're deluded with respect to.
Simche rawa chuba jimbe she, rawa chuba jimbe mongba mariba teke chotakbar gyurwe, tanya du yebe sinendarwa, chotakbar gyurwe, simche chi yorwa ku rawa du mene rawa du yoba chotakbar gyurwe, simche tele mene nyingchi kumgyores, tende lamnen di yora, mongbe takwasit.
Nói cái ngu si nên giả lập chúng ta.
So here again, where we say like imputed by delusion, it is this fundamental, this ignorance that holds people and phenomena to be autonomously, truly existent. And although they aren't actually truly existent in that way, they are conventionally existent. Ni chibu de lab cha apa apa sla cha chi de aba ama sen gira ne ama sla cha ra thongye re jine shu shi chi lab gira de la den chame chu chu che be chi ta yong go ra ke sing ge ma ra tong ba da chi ne chi ka re ne ke sing ge ma te ji de ra go chu ta sa mong ba ba ming ta sha ba ji sim je de wa so ti mi ba re se ra mong be ta bo ka de cha ne di yo ra mong ba se de mong ba ma re ba me ba se ra Chidan jikden bako shida chike tongba nyeda tindigan za chu yo mare. Ming jida tangbo yo marwa. Uba rwa tangbo zugure chu dinde chigi jura kuchigira. Ne paru chil chigi chi kora nyage ama tilya ama ama rista pege chenirda. Ama shanda ne matar karkar sin lumbo seke mendra yora. Ama se en chigalam chigalara. Ne apa asera. Ne chus. Ani wadalia chusigra peba ne. Chusera, ane mesera chig lavshara, tata as lavshara. Ambuko chule mele chul lavshana, tanda ngajo chulia me se shagara, metung se shagara keho mare. A pegana tanda lavna digo maram, ko jite trasara. Tanya de chama shahura, matane zuzu sabe shagara. Sama mong beta pase tidil chane digo sundo. Mong ba chida ta change to tongba ni de tinde kene shingi mare. 아치 라우샤르 틀 밍지 람네 이 아무십 정어라 셰쿠바 첸마도 용마라 밍지 따셔도 잘라데 메나 밍데 랍셔도 키용 거라 마티엔데 코 몽베 밍따 바세 단담라 제발라 소바틴데 카멘 지데 몽베 왕 몽베 잉게 테조게 게테스 밍따 바sam지 심제시도 와스테네 따 바자 어디 심제세 따세라 방아세라 밍따라 어디 Mongbe takwa kame tis nyingji mikwa rees, tesul mingi yores. Kira nashi rawa du truwe semjen da tende ke ko mara, tende takwa chamge, semjen tele mingi yores. Tende rewa chamne rigora, yatan ri.
Như trong nhập
So here, one can understand in the second half of verse 75, this kind of like those sentient beings who are imputed by acknowledged delusion. So we could understand that delusion as referring to ignorance, the kind of ignorance that grasps at things as being autonomously existent when they're not. Or we could understand this as being like Chandrakirti talks about in his entry to the middle way, the kind of like worldly renown, that sort of we, as deluded worldly beings who we don't really know anything about the nature of things, but we give names to whatever it is, and those become conventions that are shared conventions. So we use the name father, and one person uses that name and another person understands it, and then we use, conventionally speaking, oh, that's a father. Or we put and I'm using English, but any language gives various names to things. They don't exist in and of themselves as the basis for that name, or they don't like have that name prior to our giving those conventions. Like we see something and say, oh, that's water, and people call it water. Maybe if someone had instead given that the name fire, we would be talking about drinking fire now, but we don't. We've given that thing that particular name. And so the way that things are renowned in the world is based upon worldly conventions that are designated by someone who is just a worldly person, who isn't looking into the sort of nature of that thing. And by applying that name and having it be understood by others, this is the way that things exist in the world as mere designations. And so we can speak about developing compassion for beings who are merely imputed by renown, imputed by that level of sort of worldly understanding by convention, rather than them having some sort of existence in and of their own right. So there are two different ways that one can understand this delusion in this second half of verse 75. So imputed by delusion could be referring to, again, our grasping at the self of persons and phenomena, or this kind of worldly renown.
Simjen rawa tu truba shinga du samba na shi simjen tungen yonge rawa tu truba shi me na ene simjen mende su simjen ge ro so la nyingji komba tele sanje debu sanje tokure se de ro oti tobja de nyingji komba debu ka se so simjen mende su yin oti le simjen me na se nyingji komba debu sanje de 강게 톱자래서 범게 강사직 톱자인데 강사 요구라 심지에 요구라 강게 톱자인데 인지 공부를 대부 매번 주로 선하시고라 인지 공부를 대부 매번 차거래 신앙받기라 잖아 심지에 매나 심지에 인지 공부할 때는 대부 상계 톱을 때 대부도 수고 톱고요라 범게 요구 말해서라 ende ja mole de so don dambar trube chuje rawa tu trube chuje simje yo mare sanje ji ko ma thoye yo mare suwara ende ja mole de se mongba sne medo ene ta ba sa ya mongba ge rawa simje yo ba te rawa tu yo ba mongba ge rawa tu yo ba samye ge simje te so la mene ni chi ki go ara 이 공개돼 라와도 두에 매네 때네 딱밤 텐데 심제티 제부터 그래서 그래서 이니디 칠랍잖아 시간이 돼.
So then, continuing into verse 76, it begins, you may ask, if there is no sentient being, whose is the goal? So again, the kind of qualm that is raised is if there is no sentient being, and again, this is no like truly really existent sentient being, then whose goal is it? If there is no self, then how can they be desiring Buddhahood or liberation? And so here they respond that we grant that such desire is indeed delusive. So here there is a being for even though it's not an autonomously existent sentient being, there is one for whom the result is attained. So this desire, this kind of wish that they have to attain liberation is indeed delusive. delusive in the sense of holding to it as being inherently existent, even though it is not, or holding sentient beings to be inherently existent, even though they are not. So these first two lines, even though there is no autonomously, independently existent sentient being, there is one for whom there is a goal. Here, the second line is sort of saying that we grant that such desire, their wish for liberation, is indeed delusive.
Nếu như không có người hữu tình thực có, thì ai là người chứng quả? Trả lời là đúng thế. Theo chân lý tối hậu thì quả thực không có chúng.
심지어 동해 녀월시에 돈도 세워라. 라니 지 대부 산제 토베스 제도기 내급소스. 동반이 무슨도 또도 고 타니에 쳐도요 말와. 제도기 내급소 여모시 많이 배몽바. 동반 메샤데 동반 메네세. 동해 녀월시도 제비 몽바 동메차세. 타니에도 여바데 동반 메차세. 타니에도 여바데 요데 에스거라. 어찌 줄람나.
So here, then it continues saying, so still, in order to eradicate suffering, effective delusion, whose result is understanding of the ultimate, is not prevented. So here, when it comes to sentient beings who are suffering, even though these are not autonomously, independently, truly existent, but are rather imputed by delusion, it is still the case that one is able to achieve a result. So even though, and here it speaks about sort of the times of post-meditative equipoise. So when one is in meditative equipoise, having a direct realization of emptiness, there are no conventional phenomena. But when one arises in the post-meditative periods, there is this kind of a delusion with regard to, or it's a non-afflictive kind of a delusion that imputes sentient beings. And it is through this sort of application to that goal that one is able to eventually achieve such a goal. So even though one sort of asserts that it's not existent in the way that it appears,
Rani songa kumbu songa le te me ku beche ai ka sura asa rangya tu be che tong ba sigora rangya tu be che je tong ba to ne te sire simbe ko ne simje la mi yora ni ji de le so me gu do simje sam la mi be ni ji che la mi be ni ji ming ming la mi be ni ji sum yora ya za ko tong ba ni ma do ba che simje ko na chi da anye tu ye be simje tong e nyong da nyong du sam la ta ne Niji chenpo kieso na semchen tsamla mibe niji siyo na. Ta semchen midaba keji ki chui nangi dawe sungya neshi keji ki jikpa ta semchen sudu rangya tuba chi meba pungbu sung ni chi sung na mada koran lo su nguye sungya meba rangya tuba tsayo ki taagi tongba sikra rangya tuba tsayo ki taagi tongba semchen koran zu rangya tuba nga pungbu sung ala mada koran nga de loga yebandi samla kogu yara di ko samla ko anashi mena koran samla tende je ko ne tunga nyong de do samsa tende miye yora I chö samla pumbi chö samla mini tabe simjala mini nyichi kigora Mingmila maybe you said, don't buy it on the same day. Rawa Mebalanga, some Rawa Chisamlatan, Nai, some Rawa Samlata, and each Chakang in Somlojo Kondunga, Tradoche, and the land Ramadasa Soso Tumenyo, they do something. Mingmila maybe you just said, you just some shagara. What is it, Lapsana, to do to Indira?
Cho nên vì đạt được quả vị
So here then this as it says in the second half of this verse, that again, in order to eradicate suffering, effective delusion, whose result is an understanding of the ultimate, is not prevented. So here one might think that, well, who is it that attains the result of this path? And it's saying, well, sentient beings do exist. They just don't exist in the way that they are perceived. So whatever is sort of designated by delusion is to be accepted. So mere sentient beings, the merely existent sentient beings, are to be acknowledged and to feel compassion for them. So here one develops the kind of levels of compassion, and we talk about 3 different kinds of compassion. The sort of compassion that observes mere sentient beings, sort of sees them as suffering and wishes to relieve their suffering. And then there is what's called the compassion that observes phenomena, in the sense of recognizing sentient beings as being impermanent, as being momentary, disintegrating moment to moment, and thereby lacking that kind of self-sufficient, substantially existent sort of existence. They don't have that kind of self-sufficiency. And understanding sentient beings in that way and feeling compassion for them is the compassion that observes phenomena. And then there is the kind of compassion which is sometimes referred to as unobservable, wherein one understands this is conjoined with an understanding of emptiness, recognizing that all sentient beings are suffering really due to their holding things to be autonomously, independently existent, grasping at them as truly existent. And so that kind of compassion, which is qualified by being non-observing, as in not observing truly existent sentient beings and acknowledging that they're grasping at true existence as the source of their suffering, it is due to cultivating those types of compassion that one is able to ultimately attain the final fruit of Buddhahood.
Okay.
So we'll stop there for today.
Wanje seke sa shen on benzare ke aho chichare koyo de koyo so re ke wo re ra sha lu wa po lo zamboli no palan che chandra mi le dang le pa nga ya shen Yuan den da lam jo do drami nyen dan drami nyen ge da rinpo che re wo pa san ge shen de che pa ma me pa ye lo do kolo rinpo che nyo wo rinpo che tsu mo rinpo che rinpo rinpo che ma ven rinpo che Tajo Rinpoche, Mabe Rinpoche, Teche Baye Pumba, Ge Mate, Alo Ma Karma Mendo Ma, Tobe Ma Nase Ma, Ticha Ma Nye Ma Dawa, Rinpoche To Chole Namba Gebe Genze, Usola da mi penjo poson sopa matsa me Sashin yi dong a te da chinchen tsawa dan gyuwa che Panden lama tamba namdan kewa tuyan yongi gewe shingen chimbo Gen rinpo jingen shengani tekwa chimbe sunje samo Shuye yendo shingam bewa ki tujin rowe tendo shesos shene janta son rowa mangyo nange tada nyembe simjen tamje la tuzewa chimbe goni sishi chodan tumonge ngato malewa zedo su Zoi je bege chong shin me do chang re rang shin de gen bai de sang ge shin de me den bu Logananda Shinga Chevasho Sai Bege Choshin Sangye Jende Mide Dogenanda Shinda Chevasho Aye Bege Chonshin Medo Chang Re Yende Gen Bai De Sangye Shinde Dembe Drogenanda Shinla Chevasho Idam Guru Mandala Kanaya Tayame Gewandi Nyudoda Lama Sanyen Drugyuni Tochigamali De Salakavasho Chanju Senjo Rimbochi Maje Wanan Keguchi Gewanyamba Mewai Kone Kondo Pewa Show. Okay, tomorrow Sunday we have Pandita's class at 10 to noon. And then we have brochures for upcoming events of Chants Chujir Moche. We have, please take out and distribute it if you have time. Whenever you have visit some Vietnamese grocery, and then we have dinner
Sure.
on log. Lost. Lost. Pandita say you don't need to offer mandala every day, every time. So we will think about that. And so, and then we have a ticket available for the 14th evening, Sunday evening with the Chance Jimich. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, Rinpoche nói là ngày mai là Chủ nhật mình sẽ có lớp, Ngài Pandita sẽ dạy từ 10 giờ sáng tới 12 giờ trưa. Và ngày hôm nay thì Rinpoche đã in mấy cái chương trình để mà tiếp đón Ngài Gosok Rinpoche, Gala Rinpoche đã để trên cái kệ ngoài kia. Thì bây giờ mình mỗi người ai mà có thể thì mang những cái mà flyers đó để mà phân phát cho bạn bè, gia đình, người thân mình, hoặc là những chỗ nào mà mình biết là người ta sẽ nhận những cái đó dùng cho mình, tại vì có nhiều cái chỗ người ta không nhận, nhưng mà mình hỏi coi nếu mà chỗ nào người ta đồng ý người ta nhận cho mình đó thì mình để đó cho người ta. Và có cái chương trình đặc biệt là buổi tối thứ Chủ nhật 14 tây tháng 4 á, là có cả một cái chương trình riêng cho cái buổi lễ buổi tối tiệc chay buổi tối đó. Thành thử ra là tất cả là Rinpoche đã để sẵn ngoài kia rồi. Và ngài Pandita nói rằng là không cần phải mỗi ngày học mà lên cúng dường Mandala đâu. Thành thử ra bây giờ mình phải tính lại cái chuyện cúng dường Mandala đó. Nhưng mà cũng may là mình cũng lên gần hết rồi. Chỉ có một ít người là chưa có lên được thôi. Thành thử ra là mình phải tính lại cái chuyện đó. Yeah. Nguyện đem công đức này hướng về khắp tất cả đệ tử và chúng sinh đều trọn thành Phật đạo. Oh, okay, yes. Yes. Dạ, ngày mai cô Katrina không có thời gian để mà thông dịch cho mình, thì người ta Rinpoche sẽ nghĩ lại coi ngày mai chương trình sẽ như thế nào. Dạ, bây giờ mình đứng lên lạy tạ ơn thầy.